Well, I will welcome everybody quickly. My name is Kim Haggart, and I am the Director of Engagement and Alumni Initiatives at the School of Architecture. And I would like to welcome everybody to our third Meet the Dean virtual series this semester to welcome Dean Malo Hutson to our A-School community. Today's talk will be on research about that Dean Hutson will talk about his research when climate resilience meets climate justice. And to introduce him, I'm going to introduce Ellen Bassett, our Associate Dean of Research.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're really excited to have everybody here this evening, and it's a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce our new dean, Dr. Malo Hutson, although we don't use doctor, we just say Mr., but we have a PhD. As many of you know, Malo came to us this summer from Columbia University in New York, took the big dive to come to a town like Charlottesville, quite a culture shock. And prior to working at Columbia, he was a professor at UC Berkeley. He holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in a field that is near and dear to my heart, urban planning. We're really looking forward to learning about his research this evening. I have to say, in the short time that he's been here, we've had some very robust conversations about the strategic initiatives we're going to take at the school, and thinking about climate change, thinking about its impacts, thinking about who's being assisted, who's not, and how we can make our research, teaching, and service much more impactful relative to climate change is something that I think we're all on board with and really excited to be moving on. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Malo Hutson.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I hope you can all hear me just fine. I'm using a different computer today, but I have to say it's great because now that I'm dean, I don't get to teach this year, which I'm used to doing. So this is the first time in my academic career I actually haven't taught. And I'm so happy to have a conversation about research, which I haven't done since I arrived. So thank you for this opportunity. And I have to say, it is so wonderful to have Ellen as the Associate Dean of Research, because she is really helping us organize ourselves and really try to move our research, not only where it's at a high level, but where it really does have impact in the world. And I think that that's, when we think about the role of the 21st century university, thinking about the A-School, it's about not only our research, teaching, and service, but it's about having this broader impact in the world, which I think many of our, if not all of our colleagues and students, and certainly you all are doing. So today I thought what I would do is, many of you have heard from me already, but I want to talk about my work in Chile. But before I dive into this small case study of this work down in Chile, I thought I'd just give you an overview of my research interest, what I've been doing up to this point, and then we can dive into this small case study and then open it up for questions. So in general, my research is at the intersection of the built environment, natural environment, and health. And so I'm really interested in, why does place matter for health? So if you talk to people, they'll say, your zip code does matter for a whole host of things, in terms of opportunity, in terms of your overall physical and mental health, in terms of your social networks, in terms of social capital. So it plays a big role in where you grow up, your built environment, your natural environment, your overall community that you grew up in. So that's something I'm quite interested in. I'm also interested in institutions. So one of the things that I've said to many people, the great thing about being a dean is that you're at an institution of higher education. And I think institutions matter a great deal. When you think of the role of a university, there's so much we can do in terms of outreach, in terms of connections, in terms of working on policy, theory. We can do it all for the most part at a university. And so institutions matter a great deal, but also when we think about governance, governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, all of that plays a big role in our day-to-day lives. So I'm quite interested in institutions. Another big part of my work is around community development and sustainability, so in equity. So I am always wondering in my work, or asking the question of, how do we engage in a meaningful way with local communities? And it's not just one way, but it's bi-directional. How do we think about equity? And I'll talk more about that in my own work. And then lastly, what I've spent my entire career doing is really focusing on the built environment, natural environment, and health. So if we were to look at this life course model and sort of, working our way from the background all the way up to the foreground, you have social and economic policies. So we oftentimes will think about educational policies, our overall economic policies, and how that shapes society. I've talked about institutions, but then working your way all the way down to thinking about neighborhoods and communities, your people's overall living conditions, their social relationships, and then really getting into the individual risk factors. So much of the work I do are with colleagues in public health and medicine, and they will talk about epigenetics and how your genes interact with the environment, how your exposure to violence or not having access to healthy food, not having access to quality housing, clean water, how all of this impacts your health. And so when you think about this from really the smallest, what happens underneath the skin, all the way up to the macro level, this is sort of the type of people I deal with on a day-to-day basis. And most of my work is really lately has been around living conditions, social relationships, some individual risk factors, but primarily from the institutions all the way down to sort of individual risk factors. Another way to think about this, if we were to look at a model which was adapted from the National Association of County and City Officials, but to your left, you have the upstream factors. So whether that be corporations and other businesses, government agencies, schools, all of the things that matter so much for a healthy, productive society. And then how that going downstream, how that shapes the physical environment, whether it be land use, thinking about residential segregation, all the way down to downstream to disease and injury. And so whether you're studying transportation planning or you're studying housing or architecture, many of these factors will influence. And so, people's everyday lives and their outcomes. And so we look at we call these the social determinants of health. And so down below, you can see if you have, program policies and programs that do not consider all different aspects of society, you can run into you can see these outcomes that are not equal, right? So you see these social inequities, whether it be around class, race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status, sexual orientation. And I can talk more about that, but working your way all the way downstream. So many of my colleagues that I work with, this is kind of the framework that we work within. Just some background before I arrived. At Columbia University, I had many hats. So I was the director of project development for Columbia World Projects. That was where it was a presidential initiative, and we took everything from humanities to the medical school and tried to take our research and scholarship and apply it to the real world. So at one point I had roughly 21, 23 projects in my portfolio. And just to give you some kind of flavor of the different projects we were working on was building a decentralized wastewater treatment facility in the Black Belt of Alabama with colleagues at Georgia Tech, University of Alabama, University of South Alabama, and others, to taking carbon out of the air off the coast of Canada and try to put it in basalt rock off the Canadian coast, to working on a election security project with Microsoft, to a digital identity project with colleagues over at Oxford University, MIT, and other places. So it was a wide range of projects that dealt with a number of issues. And so that was something that was a great deal of fun and taught me the importance of really breaking down silos within institutions. And that's something that my colleagues and I at the A School talk about all the time. If we've got 4 strong departments, but how we can break down those silos and really try to have impact. That was like before. I also was the founder and director of the Urban Community and Health Equity Lab. The idea behind the lab was simply to say, how can we work across the school at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, but also connect with colleagues across the university and then have more of an impact, not only locally, but also globally. And I'll talk more about that as well. And then I also was the co-director of the urbanism group. So all things urban at Columbia, at the Columbia Population Research Center, which was a NIH funded center. And so we just got another round right before I left, got refunded for another 5 years. And it was really dealing with all kinds of things from housing and health, to thinking about COVID-19 and its impact in communities, to infrastructure, to thinking about climate resiliency, the climate justice, and how that's impacting people and so forth. And so that I was doing a lot of work there. And then lastly, I was part of the executive committee and the leadership team that launched the Columbia's Climate School. So it was announced not this summer, but summer 2020. by President Lee Bollinger that Columbia wanted to launch a climate school. I was part of that team that was helping to design the school, from what the curricula would look like in terms of trying to recruit faculty, what the focus would be, how it would be structured, and so forth. So it really has driven a lot of, I guess my work has kind of, I've been fortunate enough to find the jobs at Columbia that really fit into my own interest. And when I think about my overall scholarship, it's really, simply in three broad areas. As I said before, the built environment, natural environment, and health, community development, and the circular economy. And so I'm quite interested in how do we think about our cities, if we were to think about circular cities where there's really zero waste. And so places like New York and London and Beijing, many cities around the world are really focusing on how can they reduce their waste, how can they think about their transport systems, energy. All of these things are incredibly important. And so I've done some work in this area with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the UK. And I took students when I was at Columbia. We did a project in New York and also in London. So we had a chance to see what our colleagues were doing in the UK and then vice versa. So that was a great experience and something I think would be quite relevant to the work that we're doing at the A School. And then lastly, with pretty much everything I've done, there's always been looking at making sure I always see what this racial and ethnic health inequities are in all of this work, and sort of, whether we're talking about maternal health, infant mortality, diabetes, post-traumatic stress disorder, we can go on, and you'll see this gradient in health. And so not only among class, but also around race and ethnicity. And so that's something I'd be happy to talk to you more about, either if you have a question at the end of this presentation, or when you're in Charlottesville, if I'm in the road and see you. So when I think about my work up to this point, my most recent book, The Urban Struggle for Economic, Environmental, and Social Justice, really looked at 4 cities: San Francisco, New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. And what I was primarily interested in is, look, everyone's talking about neighborhood change or gentrification and what's going on. And many of you know this because you're in these cities or have done a lot of professional work in these cities. I was less interested in sort of who to blame for it, which we can have a robust conversation about. Sort of, it's a complex problem, which many of you know, but I was really concerned about how are people surviving? How are people in their day-to-day lives actually able to live and survive? Just to give you an example, if you look at a place like San Francisco, and I was looking at the Mission District, which predominantly had been, historically had been Irish. I think even before that was Italian, and then now it's primarily got people from Latin America, South America, Mexico, Central America. And it's become a hotbed for investment. It's become a place where there's been a lot of change, a lot of displacement. And people are really concerned about their culture, their identity, their livelihoods. And so you have people who are moving further and further out, which on my end, I'm concerned about climate and all these other issues and justice. And so their commute times are much longer. They're not spending time with their families, right? They've got young children. And so you could see the inequities that arise out of these kind of situations. So I was very concerned about how people were surviving. And, I come from very humble beginnings. So much of my work really comes from my lived experience, having been born to a teenage mother, and then moving around Southern California, seeing many different communities. And that really shaped my interest in the built environment, why one school was different from another school, why this infrastructure existed here and wasn't there. And so when I think back to my life, it was certainly these early on experiences that really shaped my interest, that got me asking the questions about poverty and inequality, about the built environment, why there are differences in terms of access to food and quality of housing and so forth. All right, so another big area, as I mentioned before, is not only just the gentrification in housing or neighborhood displacement in housing, but housing and health. And so my colleagues and I, and Gina Lavasi and Ana Diaz-Rue are just wonderful colleagues. They edited this book that called Urban Public Health. It's basically a research toolkit. And I have an article with one of my former students at Columbia on gentrification and health. They're really talking about the methodologies around this, how we would study it, what the impacts are, and so forth. And so this just came out on Oxford University Press, and it's out there. And so it's really engaging people that are working at this sort of intersection of the built environment, natural environment, and health. And then I also recently co-authored, well, a couple years ago now, for the Encyclopedia in Environmental Health, which is the book for all things around environment. And I have a section on urban health, and I talk about the different issues that we're facing as as we start, as the world urbanizes, what the big issues are for our health and for our overall well-being. I would say I'd stop and ask for questions, but since I'm on a webinar, we'll just have to get to the end. So I'll take a pause and let you catch up for one moment. Related to the issue of housing and health is obviously, the kind of urbanization we've seen. So I've written some pieces around sort of, how do we think about informal settlements? What are the issues there, and so forth. So I know many colleagues here, many of you are doing this kind of work. So it's quite important that we continue with this. And then before I dive in sort of my case study, another piece of work that I've been quite interested in lately is, for lack of a better term, I'm calling it the Eco Community Retrofit Project. So since I was in New York, I looked at public housing. So if you look at the New York City Housing Authority, it's some 400 and some thousand people that live in public housing. It would be the 32nd largest city, so somewhere around the size of Milwaukee. And unlike other cities that has largely gotten rid of their public housing now, New York still has it. It's not the best quality housing, and it's got a lot of problems, as you all know. But there are opportunities to say, well, what would happen if we actually were to, as a demonstration project, or work with a large housing authority like NYCHA or any other city, to say what would happen if we started to really retrofit this, and especially thinking about climate change and the impacts. And you all saw what happened with Hurricane Sandy, and then most recently with hurricane that came through, and all the flooding that occurred. New York City was already dealing with a lot of that in the public housing, moving a lot of the heating supply, heating systems and other things from the basement up to the rooftop or up to higher levels. And that's going to continue to be a challenge. But there are opportunities to think about how we can really address this, at least even just from a demonstration project, to say, what would it be like if we took an older building, completely retrofitted it, thought about bringing healthy materials, provide wraparound services, worked with local communities and partnered with local communities to think about health and how you would measure that, but really thinking about, energy efficient housing and so forth. And so I've actually just yesterday had a conversation with Block Power in New York City that's quite interested. They've been doing a lot around microgrids. And so they're interested in maybe having a conversation. But I've been working with the former mayor of Philadelphia, Michael Nutter, and his wife, Lisa Nutter, who started an urban investment fund in Charlotte, North Carolina, Philadelphia, and New York City. And the idea is to say, thinking from the built environment to workforce development to other economic strategies, are there ways to kind of do things that we think would work based on sound research, based on other things that people have done. And so this is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I hope now that I'm at UVA, I can continue on with this. And so I was excited. I had my first research meeting yesterday to start kind of trying to pick this back up where I had stopped back in June in New York. All right, so with all that said, I just wanted to give you some background on the kind of things I've been interested in. I've done up to this point. It's just a quick version because there's a lot to discuss, but I'm hoping it's a way that we can have more conversation in the future. What I wanted to spend more time on today was my work down in Chile around disaster management and recovery. I started working in Chile probably in 2013. I had colleagues, or my colleague at Berkeley at the time said there were people coming from Chile. I think you should meet them. They're talking about similar things that you're talking about, and we hit it off. To make a long story short, I started going down there, and I had a great relationship with them when I was at Berkeley, had a great relationship with them at Columbia, and I hope to have a great relationship with them now that I'm at UVA. But one of the things we're quite interested in at the time, being in California, we had a Central Valley. Chile has a Central Valley, Mediterranean climate in California, same thing in Chile, fires, floods, earthquakes, same thing in Chile. So there were a lot of similarities that made it a natural kind of place to do this comparative analysis. Little did we know that the fires would become what they are now, much what you see in Australia, Greece, certainly California, but Chile is also experiencing really strong fires, is what I want to talk about today. So my work in Santa Olga. But before I begin, I got a Columbia President's Global Innovation Fund grant, which was essentially encouraging you to break down silos, partner with people outside of your own discipline and work elsewhere. So I started to work with my colleagues in Chile. We decided to let's have a big research meeting in Chile, then take our students there and vice versa and do more things. And of course, COVID hit. So we did the first year, no problem, started with the second year, and then we kind of hit a snag once things start rolling along. So I will talk more about that. But we had our first big meeting in November 2019. We were talking, or 2018, excuse me, 2018. We brought leaders from all across the different disciplines, from architecture, from geography, from urban planning to economics, to you name it, for engineering, to talk about the issues around disaster management recovery in Chile and what they were facing. So they've had massive earthquakes, they've had volcanoes, they've had a lot of things that have really disrupted people's day-to-day lives. We then started having partnership meetings. So one of the things you'll notice around the table, it's all men. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but much of the leadership, when you go to Chile, certainly at the governmental level, it's very centralized in Santiago. So a lot of men are in the roles of power and sort of very much a top-down kind of situation. So keep that in the back of your mind. But this is me talking to one of the regional leaders of the Malo region, about 3 hours south of Santiago, and they were walking me through some of the challenges they had faced, talking about reconstruction around the fire or the earthquake, and then suddenly, February 2017, the massive fire, which I'll talk about. But this is me talking with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, which is basically like our HUD, but they call it MINVU there. And they were talking about the importance of not only the built environment, but what goes along with that, the natural environment, the kind of programming that's necessary, connecting with community organizations and so forth. And so that's with me and my colleague Magda, and then some of my students that were with me at the time. Okay, so this particular picture is of Santa Olga. What you see is after this town burned down in 24 hours. And so in the 1960s, Santa Olga was an informal settlement. Many of the people who settled there worked in the agro farming industry or timber industries, a lot of different things in the area, but they were not paid very much money. And then in January 27th, as I was mentioning, 2007, a wildfire came through the town, burned it down in 24 hours. It was the worst fire in modern Chilean history. 1,000 homes were destroyed, schools were destroyed, childcare center. 10 people were killed, 5,000 people were displaced. So we've seen this happen around the globe, and it's likely to continue to happen if we look at the trends of what's happening in terms of climate change. And so it's very devastating to this region. And since I'd already been working with the federal government and with the regional authorities, they asked could I come back and sort of see what was happening and how we can think about engaging with local residents for a redevelopment plan for the region. So this is just a picture and a story about what happened. And within 3 months, the federal government said we've got to rebuild. You can see in the background the scorched forest. It was beautiful beforehand, much of what you see in California after the fires. And you're talking about an informal settlement. So then there were issues around who owns what and the quality of housing, who has a right back to the land. So all of these issues came up. And on this day, when we were there taking pictures, some of the former residents, or they had been displaced at the time, came up to the government officials and said, "You're taking too long. Like, what are you doing? What's the plan?" And they were going through their normal process, like, "Well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that." And they were just saying, "This is unacceptable. Like, we've got to be at the table. We've got to know what's going on. We've got to help people who are most in need." And so the conversation shifted not only from the physical infrastructure, but really talking about all the other things that people needed. And so I won't get into all the details, but the government has contracts with some 27 different housing developers. Many of them, this is an example of some of the housing that was rebuilt. So if you could have saw the housing before, this is quite an upgrade. I know in an A school, we're like, oh my gosh, like, many people are cringing at the moment. But, we're talking about people who really were putting together their own homes. They didn't have running water in some place, very little electricity or unstable electricity, not much infrastructure. And so now this new housing was being rebuilt. This is another part of Santa Olga, and we can talk about all of these details later, but this is all, coming from the federal government. One of the interesting things about the types of development that came, and I'll try to show you a little bit of the different models that people had choices for to move into, is the housing developers provided washing machines, I believe dishwashers in some instances, but a lot of the modern amenities that many people are used to, that in this case they weren't. And so what you started to find is some people were coupled up. So heterosexual couples, where women were then deciding to not be coupled up anymore. They decided I can have more time to do things, because they were mostly working at home, doing all the day-to-day chores. Suddenly you have a washing machine, you have a more modern house, you have a more stable home. And they said, actually, I'd rather go work. I'd rather go do other things. And their partners weren't necessarily the right partners for them. So that was an interesting thing that started to come from this as well. So I'll come back to some of this and unpack it. But you can get, this is my students and I, this is the spring, March of 2019, going through this area. This is basically a little commercial district they had set up until they can have a more formal one, but it was allowing some of the local merchants to open up their own businesses. What you can't see to the left is a big transportation corridor. So there's a major thoroughfare right here. And there used to be this small bus stop off this busy highway. And what they did is they created a actual terminal where you can pull in and people could actually get on the bus. The buses could actually stop, or it's safe. People get on the bus and then get back into the main traffic. And right off of this bus terminal was a place to get, just a snack, connect with your friends, or for people who are traveling to stop and just take a break. So this became a bigger point for people to just connect and also think about the local economy. Right here is one of my colleagues, Maria Garces, with the glasses on and the foreground. And in the middle there is Maria Sepulveda. Maria Sepulveda was one of the residents who really took it upon herself to organize the community. Overwhelmingly women, I would say 95% women, if not more, that were really the cornerstone of this redevelopment. They said, they were the first responders in many ways after the disaster. They were the ones that were doing all the informal organizing. They were cooking for people who didn't have any food. They were checking in on their neighbors. They were taking a tally of who had been lost in the fire. So you can imagine all the things that were happening here. And she just really played a pivotal role in a lot of this. And so we were very happy to take a tour with her and hear what's going on and to be in contact with her. So Maria Garces is a great colleague of mine in Chile, doing great work. And we were able to go around with Ms. Sepulveda. So that was a good experience to just hear from their vantage point. Not only do they want to see the redevelopment, but they're saying things like, we need a health clinic, we need a childcare center, we need a brand new school, we need to think about transportation, we need to think about the economy. Oh yeah, and by the way, we need to change the way that planning is done, the way that development is done in our communities. And we really want to create a more equitable system that allows for a more robust process of community engagement, and that takes in the whole needs of the community. And so that was something that she really pushed for. So for many of the residents, what we found right away is after the wildfire, they wanted to be part of the planning process, which I just said. They wanted their voices to be heard. They didn't want it to be a top-down kind of situation. They wanted to be a part of what was happening. You saw major inequities along the lines of gender, because women, they did all the organizing, they met the needs of the community, they fed people. As I said, they led all the planning efforts. Unpaid, right? No surprise there, but unpaid. This is all of them just doing it. Many of them getting jobs to support themselves and doing this also. And so that they really said, we have to prioritize schools, we have to prioritize the things that really matter for a community. And so they were carrying a heavy burden. In 2020 or 2019, I sent a couple of my students from my studio class from my research lab to go back to Chile. And they worked on the ground here in Santa Olga with my colleagues in Chile to do research interviews, to work with the residents, to document the process. And so there's some articles that are coming out about this around development, gender inequities, especially after disasters. And so from what I'm understanding from my other colleagues around the world, this is typical of what they're seeing in their own countries as well, is that you see women leading the way, doing all of this organizing work. And then at the end of the day, oftentimes the people coming in trying to drive the change or to dictate how the change is going to happen are largely dominated by men. And so this was a great opportunity to see, like, yes, we need to rebuild in a different way. We need to build in a much more sustainable way. And I can talk about that later. But also we have to think about these real gender inequities, and we have to think about our children, and we have to think about the future so that they have other opportunities besides just working in the forestry industry or working just in the local areas, which is, these are all important jobs and valued jobs. But at the end of the day, they're saying we want our children to be able to have a brighter future and to do other things. So with that said, I want to show a video.
So
Some people can't see the video, but essentially this video was put together by my students. It shows an aerial view of what happened with the redevelopment process. And there's a school there. The school got completely destroyed. It is one of the most beautiful schools I've ever seen in my life. It is a completely sustainable school, local materials. It's circular with the playground and plazas in the middle for children to interact. Now it's such a wonderful school that you have people in the region wanting to go here. But it was just an example of, if you get residents involved and you partner with government and you partner with the private sector, the kind of things that you're able to do. So I could talk more about that. But unfortunately, I had teed it up for this video because the video was going to show you this wonderful, overall view of what happened. But I'll stop there. So, all right, well, that's fine. We're at 5:41 and this video is a few minutes long, and we would have been, or we're about 5:35, I guess, 5:36. So we'll be fine. All right, so why don't we just open it up for questions you may have. I can elaborate a lot more. It's hard when I'm on Zoom to talk about research, but I'm happy to have more of a dialogue. So I'm sure people have great questions, and we can go from there.
the first question is from Crystal Morphus. Will you discuss the alignment of the global sustainability monitor?
The Global Sustainability Monitor, I'm not sure. Minor? Maybe I'm not sure. Well, we do have a minor.
Yes, the minor.
That's what I'm thinking. Probably a minor. If you have like me, autocorrect drives me absolutely crazy, especially with a name like Malo. It always gets changed to. Well, I think the Global Sustainability Minor is a really important one. I think there's room to do even more. And so just to give you some overview about what we're focusing on. So there are 5 big areas at the A school we're focusing on, but one being climate justice and climate resilience. It's something that we are doing well. It was great to see my colleague, Professor Ellen Bassett, and who's now, as I mentioned, Associate Dean of Research, who has been on the steering committee of the Environmental Resilience Institute at UVA, has been one of the key voices in this area, one of the important voices, not only within UVA, but also externally and doing work globally. So we're well positioned in terms of all the research that's happening. And I think that with our research, as well as with our teaching, we can do more in these areas. And so I think the Global Sustainability Minor that's headed up by Phoebe Chrisman has a lot of opportunities. It's so popular. I believe that my colleagues, Gina Ripple and Barbara Brown Wilson, also taught a J-term course. So that's in between the fall break and the spring break. It was just oversubscribed. And people loved it. They got wonderful reviews. And so I think the appetite for doing more in this area, I mean, I don't have to tell you all this, there's a great demand for it. And I think we can do more. I know that Ellen, through her work, she's just surveyed faculty on the kind of things they're doing. She's thinking about helping us think about how we integrate all of our work across the A school, all 4 departments, but also across grounds. And I think as we get a clear picture of what we're doing, what are the key courses that we could be offering in these areas that provide students with the skills that they need, provide them with whether it be also policy analysis skills, economic analysis with design excellence. So there's so many opportunities that I think there are many angles that we can take on this from all 4 departments. When I think about, architectural history, I think about my work in Chile. You can't talk about redevelopment and disaster without talking about people who said, my ancestors have lived there for hundreds of thousands of years, right? They're not leaving, no matter what's happening in terms of climate, unless they're really forced to. And so anyway, I think there's a lot we can do. And then lastly, I'll say with our certificate program. So when you look at the real estate design and development program, is school-wide. The way that Ellen has spoken about this, and Ellen, you can jump in here. The way Ellen has talked about this, it is very much a program that's thinking about these broader issues around climate resilience, climate justice, thinking about development, thinking about health, some of the things I've laid out, thinking about a whole bunch of other, critical things around infrastructure, and much more. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities through that. And then we have the Masters of Urban Design program coming in the fall, next fall, that'll be launched. That is very much picking up many of these themes, and we'll go deep in that area. And then we have historic preservation as well. And so I think with our 3 certificate programs, not to mention our how we integrate this into our regular programs, as well as our undergraduate programs, it's incredibly important. Ellen, jump in. Others jump in, please, my colleagues, if I left something out.
There's more questions for you.
Yes.
We have a couple questions specifically about kind of agency and, who's kind of doing the work in your specific example in Chile. So one from Alan Bacon: does Chile have an agency analogous to FEMA that can provide immediate relief after these disasters?
They actually do, and they're one of our partners. It's a great agency. It's very much like FEMA. And what's interesting is the director of that agency actually was in the military, was in Haiti during Haiti's earthquake, and actually lost his wife. And he decided to stay on after Haiti's major earthquake, not this most recent one, but the one back in, was it 2010 or 2011? But he stayed on. That transformed him. I mean, obviously it was a great loss. He went back to Chile to head this up. And so I've spent time with them, and to go into their control room is quite amazing. But they see the changes happening in terms of, with the major earthquakes. They obviously had the tsunamis that came through and wiped out many of the developments along the coastline. With the recent fires, they see that moisture at night is not, they're not getting the kind of level of moisture they used to get. You hear the same thing in California. That's making everything much more, the land much more brittle, much more prone to fires. And so he's quite concerned about all these things. And so they do a great job, and they're quite well financed. And so there is an organization like FEMA, and they're very involved.
And then Christine has a follow-up question to just learn a little bit more about your work in urban and rural areas, either in the US or Chile. How have women continued to engage with the rebuilding, and have you seen the kind of follow-up of the work that was done immediately after?
Yeah, so I think I missed the question. It said someone who's doing the work on the ground. I think it's an excellent question. So one of the things that we're very clear about when we decide to have a partnership, for me as a professor that really focuses on health inequities, thinking about community development, was not a US professor flying into Chile and tell them, oh, this is what you should do. It was actually the way we tried to structure it in the very beginning was, can we learn from each other's experiences? And again, you have to remember at the time I was at Berkeley, a lot was happening in California, very similar to Chile. Get to New York, similar things are starting to happen with all the hurricanes and flooding that we're experiencing. So you find that, it doesn't really matter where you are, it's all very relevant. And so it was very important that we actually worked with real organizations on the ground. And that when I come to Chile, it's me as a professor with a certain perspective, not me telling them what to do. And I'm always asked, what should we do? What should we do? What should we do? And I really try to avoid telling my colleagues what they should do. I say, well, in my experience, working in different communities, here's what we've done. Here's what I've seen has worked. Here's some of the issues I've seen that's happened around engagement and so forth. And so getting back to the big question is sort of, was about the women and sort of their experience. Okay, so in this case, I had seen similar things in the US, not quite to the extreme in Chile, and sort of how women have been so marginalized from the process. Not to say it doesn't happen but in my own personal experience, there was very difficult in the very beginning because they said we were not going to go away. They were called all kinds of names, as you can imagine. So they organized through their WhatsApp to get all the other women in the community together. They held strong. And as they started to get results and get buy-in from the community and say, they speak for us, they were able to get some of the things. And I really wish this video was shown. I'll find a way to get it posted, because you can see now with the health clinic, you can see with the emergency, basically a fire station that's been built. You can see the school. Much of it, I'm not gonna say all of it's because of women, but much of it is because of the women taking the leadership position. Now they're still continuing with it. They're still part of the process. Many of them are thinking about running for office or doing other things, and they're working. And so there are a lot of other opportunities that are trying. I'm not saying it's all a perfect picture, but it's a picture where people are saying we can do this and we can do it better than what was done before, by actually trying to have more voices at the table, by trying to be more inclusive. And frankly, thinking about the real democratic process, right? We talk about democracy all the time, but we also think about a big part of democracy is civic engagement, is engaging the populace, right? And so that is what the local residents are trying to do. And what we thought as researchers and some of us thinking about policy is, how do we work in partnership with them so they can tell their narratives, so we can document this process? And there are a whole bunch of other things that have come up that are not part of this discussion, but with the federal government, insurance, it's a huge issue in the US, it's a huge issue there, it's a huge issue around the world. Do you continue to insure places that continually face disaster? Do you continue to rebuild in areas that continually face disaster? And if you're to make those decisions, then at what point do you have these cutoffs, right? And so these are the big conversations that people are having, because it's cost hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to rebuild. And so this is another conversation. Other questions? I'm giving long answers. I'm trying to cover many things. So I apologize.
I'll help I'm going to combine two because they're a follow-up on each other. Stephen Johnson asks that one of the biggest concerns as a practicing planner that he feels is how far behind practitioners are in comparison to planning, research, and teaching. How can we get more research and best practices into practice? And Betsy Del Monte follows up with a similar question. Architects are similarly lagging behind. And are there ways to bring research on the social determinants of health into the practicing world for architects as well?
Yeah, so look, I think there's a role for theory and practice, right? I'm a dean, I'm also a professor, but I also believe we have to have a foot in the real world. That's why I'm in a professional school. And it may seem, I don't know what people's individual, I know Betsy, good to see Betsy, by the way. I don't know what people's individual experiences are out in the field. I will tell you from experiencing teaching with students and all of that, is that sometimes you get so bogged down. You talk to people doing affordable housing or designing different things. They're so focused on a small project and it's an important project, right? I'm not minimizing this, that sometimes we forget to think about scale. And so if you think about where we are with the need for real climate resilience and climate change, it all matters. It's all important. And I think that what we have to do is to understand how every little piece can connect to the bigger piece, right? So whether you're an architect and you're thinking about design and design excellence or healthy building materials, I gave a keynote to the AIA Committee on the Environment back in June, and the California branch, and they're all over this. This is something. So I would say at the A School, this is something we're thinking about. I think that the conversation we're continually need to have is about scale, and how do we think about our work across multiple scales. And you have urban environmental planning. If you think sort of the map, regional or state or even local, right? And you could think about going all the way down to architecture. Someone might be designing one particular piece. I mean, it just depends on people's approach to it all. But I think having an understanding of how all of these things are integrated is an important one. And I'm confident at day school, this is what we do well in terms of our day-to-day conversation. Now, how do we articulate that out into the real world, our research and scholarship to where it has impact? I think this is exactly what Ellen's helping us do. This is exactly what the faculty are asking for. This is exactly what our students want, is that we don't want to be a school that just theoretically we say wonderful things, research-wise we do wonderful things. But let me just tell you as a dean, how could we talk about climate justice and climate resilience in the Commonwealth of Virginia and not engage Appalachia? We can't. We can't. We can go all around the world, but if we can't just engage here in our own backyard, then we're not doing our job. So I think that we have to do all those things. I think we're committed to doing those things. You think about, I think Virginia is the 6th or 7th most disaster-prone state in the US, right? The Commonwealth here. So there are lots of opportunities. And I know my friend and colleague, Curtis Brown, who's at the Virginia Department, who heads the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, is interested in having more conversations with us. And so I think there's lots of opportunities. We have to work on getting our research and scholarship out to our alumni and out to everyone else where it's accessible, it's available. And this is a problem. I mean, who reads academic journals? And it costs so much to get access to these journals. And our work has to be, we have to be able to translate it into something that makes sense and it's just not, a bunch of acronyms where people are like, what are you talking about? We have to have impact. So I think that, there are many ways as an institution of higher learning, we can break down those barriers and have this bi-directional learning. So I would love to have practitioners come back and talk to us. And so we're talking about hosting something major next year in the fall around climate justice, climate resilience. That would be a national, international conference here at UVA that highlights the work we're doing, highlights the work that you all are doing, but really have a conversation about what we can do better, how we can work together. And so these are some of the questions I think we can start to integrate during that conference.
Thanks, Malo. I think you actually answered Gina Haney's question about local work. So that was perfect.
Yeah, what is it about, just in case? Gina, I answered it?
Yeah, you did. She was asking about what are we doing regionally? All this international work is great, but what could we be doing more regionally? And I also have a question from Rhiannon. Could you speak more to the concept of circular housing in the affordable housing and community retrofit project?
Yes.
The retrofit project, a direct challenge to gentrification?
Is it a direct challenge to gentrification?
Yeah.
It could be. Well, look, as I tell people all the time, and when I was writing my book, like in San Francisco and DC and New York and in Boston, when you see investment in the infrastructure and you don't see investment in the people, there's a problem. And everywhere I've seen investment in infrastructure and not the people, those people 10 years, sometimes even less, are no longer really there, right? And so we can do more than one thing. You can make investments in infrastructure, and you also make investments in people. If you walk around New York City and look at New York City Housing Authority, the actual buildings, we can do so much better. You go to San Francisco, it's embarrassing, right? I've done work out there, and it's boarded up, and people are living there. It's inhumane in many ways. And housing should be a human right. We're the United States of America. Housing should be a human right. It is part of what you need, quality housing for your overall well-being. And COVID has shown us that even more. If you already didn't know that, COVID definitely shows it. So I think that with the retrofit project is saying, well, you've got these buildings that are centrally located. In New York City, they are near subways, they're near major institutions like Columbia, the Met, all kinds of, you think of it, Central Park, waterfront. So people are not as isolated as you might find in other cities, right? And so you look at the work of earlier urban sociologists like William Julius Wilson, and they'll talk about social isolation and all. We're not talking about that in New York City. I'm not saying like out in Brownsville and other places you have it, but for the most part. So why can't we utilize what's there, especially at a time when we think about buildings and the release of carbon into the atmosphere and how inefficient these buildings are, to do more, to say we actually have housing. It may not be the best housing, but we still have affordable housing that in New York City and other places around the US that we could do this, in the world for that matter, with that focus on social housing. And so it's saying we can do more to build more quality or retrofit more housing, make it more better quality, but also make investments in the people around all kinds of things. And so in the case of New York City, well, what's the cost for children for lead poisoning? What's the cost for asthma? What's the cost for people who are dealing with crime and all those things in post-traumatic stress? If you were to start to tackle that, like some of my colleagues have been talking about, like Deanna Hernandez in the School of Public Health, grew up in the Bronx, is talking about from a health perspective what we can do in Harlem and the Bronx. It's really on the cutting edge, and it makes sense. And we could say this all day long, but she's actually doing it. And so teaming up with great people, you talk to a group like Block Power, who's saying, what does a microgrid look like for public housing that is more efficient, that actually thinks about quality? People don't have heat, they don't have running water that's consistent, all kinds of issues that you hear about. You just Google NYCHA and read, you'll know all about it. But they're not, not to pick on NYCHA, but many places are like this. What about places in rural areas that don't have running water, that don't have heat? Who's speaking for them? Who's advocating for them? Who's having this conversation? And one of the things I love about being at the A School is we don't talk about the urban and rural as though it's a dichotomy. We talk about it as a continuum. They are interconnected, they are interdependent, they are so important that we support each other and relate to each other. And so I think as a school of architecture with 4 great departments, this is something we can do. And we have been doing. You look at landscape architecture and the Center for Cultural Landscapes, and you look at urban environmental planning, architectural history, and art. This is the kind of conversation we continually have. And it's not this dichotomy, but instead it is this continuum, which I think is incredibly important. And whether we're talking about food systems, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about overall preserving our environments, our watersheds, all of this is regional. Again, getting back to scale, it's interconnected, but it's regional.
I think we'll wrap up with 2 questions that, again, are sort of connected. And they bring us back to our students, and specifically the relationship of students' exposure to research. The first is from an anonymous attendee. Do A School students provide similar research opportunities to undergraduate students to the ones that you took your students to Chile? And the other question is from Wendy Barnes. Do first years get an opportunity to hear of your and other faculty's research experiences to both motivate and excite them towards the art of what's possible in their field of study? And then she just follows up, very exciting work, and thank you for sharing. There's been a lot of those that we haven't listed for you, but.
Well, I'm 3 months in. I will tell you, and talking to Ellen, she has a passion for this, to take our research, our scholarship, and it has to be relevant. And I know everything that she's been doing and the colleagues she's been talking to think about the student experience all the time. And so I would say that yes, in terms of the research, and the research is off the charts. I mean, if you look at, you'll just sit tight because Professor Bassett will have a lot to say about this, but the research money that we've several NSF grants that have just come in, another major grant that's just come in over, $500,000. These are all opportunities to hire graduate students, to hire undergraduates, and to connect them. Now, if you look at what's really effective in terms of outcomes, I like to think about the students' growth, leadership. Mentoring is so important. And I forgot which study was done recently, but they said, when you look at the most successful people in the world, they'll go back to their college experience, they'll say, it was having a mentor, it was having that mentorship. I think we're in a position, given that the school is really very much like a family, to where the faculty can mentor graduate students can also engage with our undergraduates, and also the faculty can mentor both of them. But that's a model that works really well that I've seen. And I think that's something we're well positioned to do. I know it's happening here. I can't sit here and BS you and tell you, I know everything, because I've only gotten here. I've been 3 months in. It's happening. Now you should talk to Professor Bassett and other seasoned faculty who've been around for some time. But from what I've seen with the Beth Meyer, with the Peter Waldman, with the WG, a Bill Sherman, I can go on and on. There are so many faculty that are engaged with students, and think about the student experience. It's there. Are there opportunities to travel? Absolutely. And then there'll be even more as more faculty continue to do this research and we can actually travel post-COVID. And then the last thing I think is about how do students get exposed, or what are the opportunities for exposure to the kind of research that's happening? We're working on that, but we have a lecture series. We have our faculty who are in the classroom every day talking about their work, and it's something we can do more of course. And that's something I hope to focus on more. But I will say, one of the things I love about UVA, the A School, and also I think is something we can do a better job on is we're very humble. We're probably humble to a point that it's all maybe a slight flaw if there's such a thing. And I mean that in a sense that they're doing such great work. Colleagues here are doing such great work, but they don't beat their chest and say, look at all the things I'm doing. Maybe because I just came from New York where, there's a lot of egos in New York, but I get here and the kind of work that people are doing is really amazing. And they're very humble about it. They're like, this is what I'm doing. So if there's ways for us, and it's perfect to have the creative director of communications here, Sneha Patel, to tell us how we can start to articulate the work that we're doing, translate it into the way that our colleagues had just asked about how we can get our research out to the real world, out to the practitioners, out to the policymakers. This is something I know we are all very concerned about. And we are a public institution. We were founded by Thomas Jefferson. The good, the bad, the ugly, the bottom line is the whole purpose was to focus on democracy. The whole purpose was to give back to the public good. We are well positioned to do that. We're committed to do that. We're focused on the public realm. And I can't think of a better place to do that than here at UVA.
All right, well, whew. After that whirlwind, we want to say thank you very much, Malo, for speaking with us this evening, and really want to thank all of the alumni, students, faculty who are with us on this webinar. It's been really wonderful to learn more about your work, very inspiring. And I think in general, just to lean in on that last question, undergrads have lots of opportunities to do research with us. And it's really a commitment that the university has made at the highest level. So we benefit from that as well. So again, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing everybody at another webinar. And certainly besides, thank you to Malo, thank you to Kim, Jamie, and Sneha for getting this organized and running it so smoothly. And we hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you all. Bye.